So we chose two essays, and I'm going to start with James Purden's Homesick Ore. And Karun just asked us to do about 1,000-word excerpt from each, and then we formulated a question for each. So something to start off some discussion about each essay. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. We grabbed an excerpt from page 4 from the second paragraph. So I'll read that, and then I'll jump ahead to page 8 and read the conclusion of the essay, because we thought that was a good summary of the ideas. And so he really starts with kind of introducing the ideas around the Enlightenment, and on page 4, this kind of sets his position, I think, for the paper. So he says, in a position paper relating his work to the arms race between the post-1945 nuclear powers, Rubinoff describes his own awareness as a young artist, quote, that the basis for an advanced technological economy was based on military priorities. Thus, the advanced economy ubiquitously carried the stigma that its prime engine of research had become the very military complex about which Eisenhower finally warned in his farewell address in 1961. Some of you will remember discussing that from the last forum when we talked about the military complex. The entanglement of the metallic with the military, the fact that the historical development of military-industrial power is inscribed in the structure of steel itself was already motivic in David Smith's major steel works, particularly, as Rosalind Krauss has pointed out, in the deconstructed artillery forms of the Zig series of David Smith. And the same combination of fascination for and thoughtful resistance to steel's violent history carries over into Rubinoff's sculptures in ways that are not only motivic, but fully conversant with the historical emergence of the material. Where Smith's Zig works are overpainted, Rubinoff never decorates the self-weathering surfaces of his steel forms. In the stainless steel works of Series 1 and Series 2, a further layer of texture has been produced over the years by the chance deposit of growth of lichens on the surface of the metal. That Rubinoff tolerates and even welcomes the refashioning of the work through natural processes is in itself suggestive of his tolerant approach to unexpected associations that his work takes on after the artist's involvement has been completed. Meanwhile, Series 3 and Series 4 make use of the self-weathered properties of Corten to create unpredictable surface patination, producing aesthetic interest out of a functional property of the material. So, sorry, I'm relating that to his history of, in the beginning, the intro there, of the material itself, the history of steel.
So, is it possible to actually, can you read and talk into the microphone so that we can get a decent recording? Oh, okay, good.
That's why I turned off the sound system, but I can bring everything up.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So if it's just here, it's fine?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it should be fine.
So I'm going to just skip ahead then to page 8 and read the conclusion of the essay at the bottom.
The page numbers are different.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
So it would be the third to last page, probably? Yeah. Last paragraph on that page. The effort to disentangle these entwined axiologies from their macabre dance has been central to Rubinoff's sculptural work. Commercially traded, industrial, useful forms of metal, like Corten and stainless steel, represent metal fully commodified, so that perhaps the most striking thing that this sculpture does with these substances is remove them from circulation. These materials, developed and deployed with specific functions in mind, are transformed through sculptural work into forms that make a point of their lack of purpose, reversing the tendency that reduces ore, as Rilke calls it, to the human ends served by coins and wheels. Here again, it is David Smith's Bolton Landing that clearly constitutes the major model for Rubinoff's sculpture park on Hornby Island in British Columbia, planting one foot in the art market and one in the fields around his studio. Smith anticipated the site-specific work of major artists such as Donald Judd and Richard Serra, while riding the long 1950s wave of interest, both aesthetic and commercial, in abstract expressionist art. Yet Rubinoff has gone further than Smith, Judd, or even Serra in one important aspect, by withdrawing his work entirely from the marketplace. With vanishing few exceptions, the entirety of Rubinoff's work exists in a series of fields on an island remote from the metropolitan centers of the art world and has not been offered for sale at any price. Not entirely true. Whether this is to be understood as an act of positive resistance to the alienating economic logic of the marketplace, or as a kind of resigned hermeticism in response to the general domination of that logic, the decision to concentrate on an entire oeuvre in one place under the control of the artist and entirely outside of the control of professional curators and collectors must be regarded as a major and unusual risk. The severe restrictions placed upon dissemination have clearly limited the visibility of these sculptures within a cultural field organized around the institutions of the gallery and the auction house, and have made sure that Rubinoff has hitherto remained marginal to the wider story of contemporary sculpture. This uncompromising approach to the circulation of artworks as commodities is clearly exceptional, though it might also be regarded as a logical extreme towards the theoretical rationale for site-specific sculpture ends. As Douglas Crimp has written apropos of Richard Serra's work, one context for site specificity is the idea that an essential link between a unique man-made form and a unique topography can constitute a form of resistance to the alienating logic of circulation that underwrites the commodity form. Quote, if modern artworks existed in relation to no specific site and were therefore said to be autonomous, homeless, that was also the precondition of their circulation, from the studio to the private gallery, from there to the collector's private dwelling, thence to the museum or lobby of a corporate headquarters. The real material condition of modern art, masked by its pretense to universality, is that of the specialized luxury commodity. Engendered under capitalism, modern art became subject to the commodification from which nothing fully escapes. While Serra, Judd, and others have attempted to short-circuit this logic through the aura of site specificity, Rubinoff's work remains a unique instance in which the entire body of an artist's work has been accepted from circulation in this way. In the case of Serra, for instance, perhaps the most prominent of late 20th century sculptors working on a large scale with steel, some pieces have sold for extremely high prices. The triptych 1248, for instance, realized $1.65 million at auction in 2008, while others have been displaced from their sites under other conditions. Notoriously, Tilted Arc was cut up and removed from its site by municipal authorities against the wishes of the artist, who regarded the removal of the work as transforming Tilted Arc into, quote, an exchange commodity, a mobile, marketable product. Serra has also drawn a distinction between his site-specific sculptures and his works on paper, which, unlike Rubinoff's, have frequently been offered for sale and which circulate readily in the art market. Yet it needs to be understood that Rubinoff's decision to exempt himself from the art market in this way has depended in large part upon his substantial personal wealth. By funding his work personally, Rubinoff has been free to pursue it without regard for private or institutional audiences, without relying on commissions or seeking sales. On the one hand, this is consistent with the method of the sculpture itself, in that the investment in capital, in materials, in energy, and in labor time is turned away from the imperative of economic productivity and redirected into the work of art. Money, a mode of exchange that finds its origins in smelted metals legitimated by the stamp of institutional fiat, joins Corten and stainless in being removed from the circulation that generates economic value. On the other hand, Rubinoff's distance from the metropolitan art world can be understood as yet another form of enclave, another aesthetic of resistance emerging within rather than against the economic imperative of the time. In the case of Monet and that of abstract expressionism, of course, the resistance or avant-garde mode quickly became reabsorbed as a particularly prized new product within the supposedly morbid institution it had sought to oppose. If the fate of Rubinoff's own work cannot be yet predicted, nor should the value of his attempt to produce a space for worthwhile sculptural work outside of the, nor should the value of his attempt to produce a space for worthwhile sculptural work outside the marketplace be underestimated. That attempt, quite as much as the sculpture itself, constitutes a radical gesture which no critical history of contemporary art should make the mistake of ignoring. So the question that we came up with was, in thinking about the way that he lays out the history of this material in terms of its kind of cultural, capitalist, historical resonances, how does the materiality of Jeff's work relate to the ideas brought forth through the company of ideas? So I was thinking about where we ended up last time in the forum talking about the industrial military complex, and then Jeff's big pronouncement at the end, which I think Craig and I found quite a shocking turn, that was all about the genetic modification of food. And before that, the topic was the end of the age of agriculture. So there's these really hefty topics, and I think that the paper relates these kind of ideas, but through its sort of specific following of the history of steel in some ways, and it brings up all of these things. So I guess the question I'm wondering about is, are these ideas important to the understanding of his work, and are they evident in the work? And how does this materiality relate to the work and the ideas that we've been talking about? Because everybody here, I think, has been here for every forum now, nearly.
Great. Thanks a lot for
I could try
doing that.
rephrasing it,
Well, that's good. I think you're basically asking us two questions.
Yeah.
One of which we'll probably tackle tomorrow, which is, do these ideas matter to the work, to understanding the work? And the other one, which I thought was interesting and is a challenging one, it's always asked of me. How do you see the end of the age of agriculture in the form of a sculpture park, or in the form of the work itself? And I had a conversation with James about that in Istanbul, or an argument. I think I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear some other perspectives of people who really know Jeff for a long time now, because I think there's two ways of looking at it, and I think that he says two things about that that are not necessarily the same. Does anybody have a thought on that?
I just found, thinking about his work in terms of that context, he's not directly referring to, a lot of artists would self-reflectively decide to talk about steel as a material itself, but obviously that's not Jeff's interest. But it is interesting to think about. And to me, it actually does relate, without intentionally trying to relate, to all the ideas that have come up in the forum.
I think you're wrong on that point, because, if you heard him when he touched steel and started cutting it, the sparks, and he says, I've come home, I've found my medium, and I know in conversations with Jeff, when he touches a piece of steel or something, he's thinking of the ground where this steel came out, or the iron came out of, and that maybe some of the alloy came from one part of the world, another part of the alloy came from another part of the world, and it went into a sheet that I'm now fabricating into a piece of art. I mean, all those little things come into play. So
I think I'm more referring to the reference to its use as a war machine.
yeah.
You know, obviously he has a very direct relationship to the material itself, but
And that's one of the things that is seen a lot. Like, you know, he resists it. He resists the images of the sculptures referring to certain things. So, except for a few of them, they're not really referring to a specific image of something. And that's pretty deliberate. I think he states that, you know, it's been stated a lot. So, you know, that doesn't stop someone like James interpreting the large Corten pieces as, you know, echoing some form of tank defenses, or, you know. But what I felt like is it's nice that you can approach a work and it can inform you in a lot of different ways based on your own history. Jeffrey doesn't necessarily, might not have intended those associations, but maybe they're a useful way of looking at them for James. I know Jay Winter had that same feeling. However, I do think that a lot of it is really isn't that. I mean, I didn't come to it with that sense. Really, I was kind of shocked. I guess maybe I didn't see those tripod kind of tank things as being connected, even though formally they're similar. I really felt like I just saw them as cultural shapes, and I really felt like they were actually more like dancing and moving, but in a very large, like there was this tension between them trying to move around and feeling like they really were in motion, and they're in massive weight. And so that's perhaps looking at it through my eyes, you know, looking through your own personality and what you're maybe exposed to.
Whereas James in Britain, those
James,
images are probably
those images are really fresh for them.
Right.
And so for Jay, you know, somebody who is you know, steeped in war, documenting the First World War, for him that's like the first association. So I don't know if those unintended associations are something that, you know, I don't know what to think about that.
I think if Jeff went to order another piece of stainless steel and found out the only source was Russia, he probably would choose not to buy it. I mean, he's quite strong morals that way, that I mean, he's very conscious where the steel is coming from. And I don't doubt, I've heard him express sometimes disturbing things that, you know, he'd like to know more of the source of where some of the things coming from, just because of the history of the steel itself.
Didn't some of the original stainless steel come from made by Krups?
Yes.
Yes.
Aaron points
Yeah.
that out in his essay.
Yeah.
Although I asked Jeff about that, and it was just one
One
order.
one-
Yeah, it wasn't
Yeah.
Or a piece
the
of an
entire.
order.
Yeah, so one part.
Yeah,
It
Maybe
really
one
disturbed
sheet.
him.
I don't know.
which was disturbing to them.
Yeah.
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 I think part of the materiality discussion, I mean, when sculpture is looked at, I'd say particularly 20th century onward, let alone where it comes from or who manufactured it, it's the material itself, like bronze, marble, all these things have this kind of burden of history in them, and because of Greek Roman sculpture or whatever along the way. The Krups thing, I think that's just kind of incidental, I think. But there was a portion of the essay speaks to the actual development of Corten steel as, it's a military grade invention, I suppose. It's not that necessarily the sculptures necessarily look like tank barricades, but that steel in one sense was developed and technologically advanced to make tank barricades or tanks or shells or something like that. I think part of that was hinted at in the essay. And when you look at how materiality and sculpture come together, it's hard, I'd say difficult to escape that kind of burden of a material. Like in sculpture in the 20th century, I mean, people build stuff out of all sorts of things, and building stuff out of rubber or polystyrene or something, it means something because of the material and the development and its use. So it's not just the literal where it's from, what it looks like, and the finished, but it's just, I mean, it's considering where, and I'm very new to the company of ideas, what ideas have come out of it. Like there is arguably a intersection or conflict, like you say. I'm not sure the nature of your argument with James, but
no, I think that when I asked James about materiality, because I asked him about the chapters when we were talking about the book and why was he choosing these things, and also about the materiality question, because I just wanted to know what he meant by that. And I said, it seems like modern sculpture really is self-conscious about its material, whereas older sculpture is more about the imagery of the sculpture, the iconography. And they said that's a really big divide in sculpture, is that on the one hand you have the materialities often being kind of denied or disguised. Really, it wasn't really about the materiality. And I think that Jeffrey's work is very much about that. Just at almost every turn, it talks about the engineering of it and the muscularity of it, and that there's a certain hopefulness, but there's also a certain sort of sense of defiance against the kind of awesomeness and scale of the landscape. You need something of strength, but the material itself is, it's got what he describes it as tensile strength as opposed to compressive strength. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting about the question is, if you look at series 1, he talks about that as a point in which the work informed him about the sickness of Europe being the continual rebuilding of Rome. And that was one of the points where I thought, okay, well, I had this argument with James, because he said, well, are these insights and ideas in any way contextual to the work, and can you really see them as being part of the work? Are there any intersections? And I said, well, to a certain extent they were internal thoughts that I thought were interesting, and I'm not an art historian, so that's why, I was interested in those things. And so we developed them as themes. So it's very possible that they're really not related, and they're just part of the working method or part of the result of the sculpture, which Stammers actually says in his essay. But I think that series, he does actually point to a part of it where the work really, the image and the working out of the work informed him about an idea about history. So I do think that the way that the materiality, he said, like, he said to me, well, the form was using steel, but it wasn't using steel in its sort of tensile strength, muscular way to move up. It was still had this metaphor of stone, which was coming down. And so I think that there is both sides. Yes, the ideas of the age of agriculture and the military-industrial complex are echoed in this, but I think the statement is to use the material to somehow make a metaphysical statement beyond that. You're not just echoing that. The statement is beyond that, but it's certainly it's rooted in it. It's aware of it. I think he's very much aware of the stainless and how it's used for how it was developed. So yeah. Any thoughts about in terms of the genetic engineering? I don't know if you remember, but the concern was, Jeffrey's concern was the drift into genetic engineering or transgenic engineering of the human genome. And I don't know if it's so much steel, because I think you would probably do it in any medium, but I think the way that he references evolution so heavily is really, does it contribute to this thought? Perhaps, I don't know which thought came first. Was it the artistic thinking process? Was it reading about, Stephen Jay Gould? Was it reading about the Burgess Shale? I don't know what came first.
You can't separate them.
Yeah.
I think.
They're
It's all
kind
part
of
the
like,
creative process.
yeah. So I think that, I don't know if the materiality is so much a part of that, because I don't know what you think. Maybe those forms maybe the evolutionary style of work could have been realized in any medium. But I think that there are traces of the ideas in the actual forms of the work, even though, the meanings that he ascribes to his work are to a certain degree, distinct and can be viewed that way as well.
I mean, for me, I guess how I sort of see it is, and I thought that the conversation about the park was interesting too, because for me, the work stands on its own, without explanation. And in some ways, even for me, without the park, I think it can stand indoors or stand in another context. But I think what's interesting to me is, and it's different for me because obviously I grew up with my dad, and so the ideas of the work are totally intertwined with the work as well. I can't separate them. I don't know how. But I think for me, part of the idea of bringing people together for the forum and having a curator is to document some of those things. In some ways for my dad to tease them out and also to articulate them very clearly, because I think for many years it was conversations with Betty and conversations with Charo and I, and it was, a lot of it was in his head, and it wasn't necessarily, he's not necessarily a natural writer. And so I think we were containing a lot of that knowledge without, I think, an archive of that. And so it would happen in a casual conversation, or it would happen in a walk through the property. And we didn't have a formal way of doing that, but the ideas, because he started, I think, developing them, the ideas are also growing. And he's doing more research and he's doing more writing, and then there's outside influences. So I think that to me, the idea of, I can't separate the ideas from the work, but I think you should be able to come to this park without the artist present, and without reading anything, and experience the work and be moved by it, and have some understanding of a transgression and a progression. But I think it's very interesting and very special to be able to have an artist to articulate so much thought and so much historical reference in the work, and that's unique. And so I think to have an artist be able to do that, especially in a community, is very interesting and unique.
Yeah, usually it's the curators or the writers, the scholars or the art historians who are speaking on behalf of the artist.
Yeah, but my dad
And that's happening, but I would say that it is unique in that it's his voice, his position.
And he's so opinionated, but he also is very well read, and for him, the history is integral to the work. So, he needed an outlet to be able to communicate that. And I think that I felt that, in a way, this forum happened because I felt, and Betty, I don't know if you felt this way too, but I felt like it was a big responsibility and almost like a burden for us to take that on, after my dad was gone. That, what if we couldn't remember all of the conversations? What if we didn't get the language right? So there was, and I don't know if you felt that way or if you did, but that's sort of how I felt, was like, so many of these conversations had happened in the kitchen, around the table, or, had happened on walks, and I was never taking notes. It was just things I felt and things that I understood from a very young age, but how would I want to communicate that to others? And, I have a sculpture in my own apartment in LA, and I watch the way people look at it, so I know that it can stand outside of my father's, explanation, or outside of the park. But I think it's so much more powerful to be able to have his own voice there.
You have a piece in Series 7, right?
It's a Series 7.
Combination of 410 and stainless.
Yes,
Yeah.
7. Yeah.
I was just
But
gonna
I
ask
also
you
have
because you
some
have
of
one
his,
at home.
his old work. Like I have a piece from that series, I believe, that was at my grandparents' house. And I have some even older work as well.
He was talking about earlier multimedia pieces. Are there any of those around?
Ones with plywood and stuff.
I have 2 small pieces that are steel on plywood.
I wonder how, I mean, people have seen the drawings, right? I mean, they're not material in a sense, but he does print them like, you know, quite self-consciously as prints, and they were in the gallery. I'm wondering what people think about those, because that's the dematerialized kind of thought of the piece. Do they have? Does it have? I mean, I always look at those and say, okay, wow, that's like a different thing than the sculpture itself. It doesn't have all of the connotations of metal. It doesn't have the context of the part. I mean, it's sort of a beautiful object or a beautiful image, but it's not the same thing as the materiality. So it's kind of interesting. You have this test right there. You're talking about the materiality of it.
And it's also interesting because in the photographs you get the landscape, and in the drawings it's just black and white,
Yeah.
and there's no context for it at all.
In a sense, like my brain looks at it and says it's simpler to process the shape of the sculpture because the landscape, there's so much complexity when you've got them in the landscape that it's so complex. If you're looking at it as a piece of art in situ, that there's something kind of calming, and there's something very lively and kind of jarring about, and very kind of overwhelming about seeing them out here.
For me, and don't tell my dad this, but
It's being recorded.
Turn off the mic.
it's okay, I think you can have it. For me, the thing is that those 3D drawings feel much a part of the technology that they were based on. I can see that they were early 3D drawings. And the thing that's amazing about this steel work is it's totally timeless, and it doesn't feel like it has any marks of a particular technology, a particular time period, a particular moment. And and as 3D drawing and as 3D software is developed, I can see that it feels older, which is really fascinating because none of the actual work feels that way. It's not aging.
So that's the material in the sense that those drawings are made in.
Yeah, they're trapped in their own technology, and I think that, I don't know, in a way that the work feels very free to me. But that's just me, I don't
It's
know.
very interesting.
I'll respond to a few things. First of all, I want to go back to what John said originally about how Jeff has talked to him and others probably about the origins of the steel is coming out of the earth. Or, it doesn't come out as stainless steel, It has a whole process that it goes through, but it comes from the earth. And I think that has a lot of meaning to what is happening here.
You think it has meaning to him?
To him.
Is it?
Another thing that I wanted to comment on was there are some works that his brother had in London, Ontario, that have been left with his ex-wife. And I think they were sort of more multimedia.
Are they cement and steel?
Yes, I only saw them once, so I don't really know. Anyway, Rose has them. Another thing I wanted to comment on was these pieces were shown in Toronto's the Science Center or something like that, and they were painted.
These are the early works.
These early works
Yeah.
here, they were painted. When he brought them to Hornby, they were what I thought really ugly, puce or pinky sort of colors that I didn't
Colorism, right?
No.
They don't need color.
No.
It throws them off
Yeah.
completely.
Although the one that I have is still blue.
Yes.
From that series.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just one
That
color?
one somehow, and it's small, but these, I just didn't like them. They were in the, that tractor shed up there used to be his old studio. They were there, just kind of there as steel for a lot of years. And then he brought them out and
Sandblasted them,
sandblasted
mentioned
them,
that.
thank you.
So he actually took the
I didn't
color
realize
off.
you said
Yes.
Yeah, you said that on the
Yeah.
tour before.
That's what he was talking
Could
And the
redate
other
them.
thing I wanted to,
Sorry?
Could redate them. If you blast them with sand, you could sign them again for another year. I didn't have
about. Old artist.
put a couple more strokes on it and give it a new date. Now it's a brand new painting.
Remix.
Okay.
in case you
No.
don't do enough that
Yeah.
year.
It's your work.
It's my work.
But
The
John,
other
that's
thing I wanted to comment on was we were talking about how all of this information has been given to us. And how many years have I sat and conversed and listened to Jeff talk about so many of these things? And often it's quite beyond what I'm able to comprehend, because the way, as you all know, the way he talks is he starts here and goes here, but he always comes back. And it's hard to follow sometimes. So over the years, that's what I've been trying to do, is follow his conversations and where he's going. So the idea of it now being documented and curated and organized, I think is really important.
And even we were saying, Susan, about the Tom Stammer's essay, like there's something about that that synthesizes things, like having these writers talk about it and from specific point of views somehow makes it make sense. And it's their point of view, but it is other people's, doing it in a formulaic kind of way, like there's, you get used to, as a scholar, having to communicate ideas so that people understand them, right? That I found I got more somehow.
Put it in a really big context.
Yeah, I don't know, everything just started to make sense to me.
Yeah, and Jeff acknowledged that almost right off the top, I think. He said something to the fact that essays seemed unusual as individuals, but brought together, these perspectives kind of shed some light on the work or something.
one of the things that he wanted to revive was a sense of, and this is right at the beginning of when we were doing work and we were looking at the materials, communicating what it is that he wanted the part to be about. Right on it hasn't changed, that statement on the front of the website, which is reviving art as a source of special insight for ideas, and it's a source of knowledge. And I think that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about these pieces, these essays, is that they are so different. And now looking back at just even some of the first forums where Jeff and I were just like, what were they talking about? And it was sort of just, off the wall types of things. Now in context, because looking back on them, I'm like, oh, well, there were ideas being generated. I mean, there wasn't as much of history, and so as we went, things became more refined because people could refer back, and things got more and more and more focused. So, I think that now we can actually talk about it in a really focused way with reference to well-articulated other ideas. At the beginning, it was less so, but you still had that fundamental vision of, art being a site, art being inspiration, art being a source of knowledge generation, and that was what excited me about those ideas at the beginning. I didn't know necessarily how art was supposed to be looked at. I didn't really care. It was just, I thought this was a fascinating artist. It was an incredible space and incredible art, and the ideas were just startling to me. I'd never heard anything like that before. So that was good enough for me to just say this needs to be put out there. Let's see what we can how people react. And I think that we should move to Tom Sandler's essay because it is one of those ones that really, I think one of the first ones that really can meet Jeffrey eye to eye. So.
Yeah, so again, it's, we'll go through some excerpts. We read through this, and the first couple of pages, it's Enlightenment intersections in the work of Jeffrey Rubinoff. So there's a bit of talk about Enlightenment, the German idealists in his education. Kant, of course, comes up big, speaks to some things that David Smith and sculpture and figurative sculpture of Rodin, the language of Anthony Caro, objecthood, temporality. A lot of it is covered, and then a mention of the Cold War, the Holocaust. There's a pretty good summary and kind of intro to the essay. For me, it's page 3. I'm not sure how it is in the other one, where these brief observations suggest that Rubinoff's interest in German idealism.
Page 6.
Oh,
Page
do
6.
you have your, which one are you
Page
reading?
6 on the.
Yours?
Yeah.
Can I just have it
Yeah.
for to follow?
Yeah.
For that? Okay, great, and then I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, we're on different copies here.
Yeah.
So, a couple paragraphs, and then we'll go to kind of the summary of some of the points made. So I'll just begin. These brief observations suggest that Rubinoff's interest in German idealism should not be viewed as intrinsic to his reflections on contemporary art.
Extrinsic.
Extrinsic, thank you. Indeed, it has been argued that the 20th century criticism on modernism, from Lukács through Adorno, reprised the paradigmatic positions first laid down by Kant, Schiller, Schelling, Hegel. The following essay seeks to understand Rubinoff's ideas and his artistic practice through his fidelity to certain Kantian and post-Kantian categories. The evidence for this connection is taken from published acknowledgments, visual analysis, and verbal statements about the German dimension in his outlook. This German dimension informs Rubinoff's insistence on autonomy and formalism, the progressive unfolding nature of his sculptural series, and his interest in the relationship between art and nature. These categories can be encountered not just in Rubinoff's writings, but arguably can also be read in his sculptural practice. The objective is to highlight low divergent concepts of time are discussed by Rubinoff and materialized within the sculptural series. But it is also to ask how the Kantian tradition might clarify the timelessness of these works in the 21st century. Timeliness. Got to practice my reading aloud. One caveat remains before proceeding, though. Although through the Company of Ideas, Rubinoff has worked to foster a forum for scholarly exchange, his practice as a sculptor should not be read as an intellectual manifesto. Rubinoff's sculptures are not mere illustrations of an underlying philosophical agenda. To read them as such would be to violate the autonomy of the artworks as instantiating their own meaning. Rubinoff has been explicit that it was through his labor as a sculptor that he came to better grasp the richness of the idealist tradition. I have found that through art, I am able to come to the understanding of these philosophers and academic art history, but I cannot, through these philosophers or academic art, arrive at creating art. In other words, while certain principles may be deduced retrospectively from the works, they do not precede or dictate their realization. His procedures as a sculptor happened organically to pose the same question as these ultra-rational German thinkers. Art making is primarily an open process for Rubinoff, orientated to find new knowledge, not expounding old ideas. So we speak to German idealists. It comes to 3 parts of Kant's arguments that are valid to Rubinoff. There's a question of autonomy and abstraction, there is the emphasis on the importance of purposive form as central to the universality of aesthetic judgment. And thirdly, Rubinoff has frequently insisted that the truths of art are not just natural, but ought to be preserved and transmitted. These 3 points are summed up on near the end of the essay, page
Third
8
to last
for me.
page.
Yeah, third to last page.
At the bottom.
At the bottom there.
Sorry.
Rubinoff then can be seen as
Everybody's page
continuing and extending certain conceptions.
Top of 50.
Okay, very good.
15.
Is it Rubinoff then can be seen?
Yes. Rubinoff then can be seen as continuing and extending certain conceptions of the artist as knowledge producer, which had their origin back in the late Enlightenment. Firstly, working in a Kantian framework, he is committed to the upholding the autonomy of non-representational art, using sculpture to scrutinize and subvert a number of structural relationships. Secondly, building on Kant's notion of the progressive refinement of beauty, Rubinoff produces sculptures which exemplify processes of conceptual and formal refinement. Each sculpture is sovereign in itself, but it also needs to be read serially as part of a developmental logic, whose progressive questioning is not dissimilar from certain musical structures. Indeed, Rubinoff admits that he felt misgivings about sculpting rounded shapes or spheres, such as those found in Series 5, since they imply a false sense of completion and might disrupt the onward momentum. Thirdly, Rubinoff links the progress within the artistic series with more universal conceptions of progress replicated in the patterns of the natural world. In this pursuit, Kant saw sculpture as a privileged medium since, in its products, art is almost interchangeable with nature. Expansive in time and space and time, Rubinoff's series are marked by a constant questioning and abhorrence for any definitive closure or facile solutions. These features explain why Rubinoff seems anomalous when placed against some of his contemporaries. His early debt to David Smith is clear, especially in the Cubi series, but the scale and weight of his work in the middle series defies the pictorial or optical labels of Greenberg's parlance. While commensurate with the human figure, the steel exudes vigor and grainy robustness, not acrobatic weightlessness. His work dissents from trends in the new sculpture of the 1960s, when, in William Tucker's harsh estimation, form was sacrificed to texture and autonomy to cheap and melodramatic imagery. Rubinoff's sculptures are more accurately described as instantiations of knotty compositional equations that can only be riddled out by the viewer through multiple views and exploration in time. They are a far cry from the simplified compression of the minimalists, with their shift from core to surface, and while the emphasis on mass and volume might place Rubinoff closer to the aesthetic of Herbert Reed, he is absolutely an abstract artist, with no visible nostalgia for the organic, figurative aesthetic cherished from Rodin and more. Rather than fit in the unorthodoxy of sculptural modernism in the post-war era, Rubinoff claims that his aim was to rekindle the historical spirit of modernism, glimpsed before the First World War. His writings are peppered with references to reviving the spiritual in art, an imperative which links artists as diverse as Vasily Kandinsky and Barnett Newman, but draws much of its intellectual force from the debates of the late 18th century Germany. To laud the spiritual in art was to proclaim dissent from the materialism and the commercialism of modernity, and hope to find in art not simply a space of negative resistance, but a source of positive alternative values. I pitted a kind of higher rationality against the lunacy of mass destruction. The Enlightenment have turned back on itself from rationality to irrationality. As Rubinoff suggests, echoing Kant, art can help us to disentangle the rational, truth, from concomitant rationalization. A vital and inextinguishable human act, art making ultimately affirms our commonality and potential as members within the natural world. In place of the tribalism, militarism, and usurped spiritual monopoly of organized religion, art is a glimpse of the universal. Such views might be written off as humanist, anachronistic, or utopian. Since the 1980s, the Kantian tradition has been blamed for the shortcomings of modernism and modernity more generally, denounced as an accomplice to all manner of elitism, imperialism, and exclusion. The end of the discipline, observes Thomas Machiavelli on the crisis of art history, amounted to a claim that the Kantian lineage was now at last over. Art, it seemed, had become post-art historical. And in his celebratory vision, as the discipline died, postmodern sculpture, defined so capaciously as to be anything, now ushered in the age of doubt. Anti-form from the 1970s onwards was given tangible expression to a paralyzing epistemological nihilism and eclecticism. Everything has become material for the sculptor of today. Udo Kulterman anticipated now that the hegemony of the spirit over other forms of human expression is finally overcome. Yet Rubinoff's sculpture shows us that by working within self-imposed bounds and selecting definite materials, a constructive program of knowing and doubting can still be pursued, a revising and testing of parameters. His work offers a subtle aesthetic response to the wider question that now dominates the humanities. What's left of the Enlightenment? Counterposing and connecting the time of nature, the time of history, and the time of art, Rubinoff's sculpture vindicates his claims to be an inveterate progressive. I'm kind of reflecting on that final paragraph and summary. The question we came up with was, Tom Stammers makes the point that Rubinoff's philosophy of art, influenced by ideas of the Enlightenment, could be viewed as utopic. I believe he says, right here. He says such views may be written off as humanist, anachronistic, or utopian. Given discussions about the context of the work within the park and these very intentional viewing conditions, is this a utopian perspective? Yes or no?
Maybe.
I think to a lot of artists, this is utopia.
So, is it, what I find interesting is should it be written off as humanist, anachronistic, or utopian? Now, I don't necessarily know that those things should be written off. But in any case, even if they were humanist.
Well, that's kind of why we chose the word utopian out of those
Yeah.
three, right? Because utopia is, I think a lot of people would believe that it doesn't exist, right?
It is, well,
it's a
that
fantasy.
is the definition of utopia, is that it's a place you can imagine that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's an ideal.
I don't know that I would connect Jeffrey's work to utopianism at all.
No, me either.
That's like so off base
No.
to me. I don't know, I think humanism, maybe. I think if you think that, certainly from a certain perspective, anachronistic could be applied to it. Utopian, I don't know.
Well, how about the fact that it's removed from any other kind of
Oh, I see.
social...
Yeah, not necessarily the
content.
work itself.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean the manner of its, like, production?
The project.
The project of its,
Oh, that's interesting.
I mean,
Is that what he meant?
Yeah.
I think so. I don't know.
Well, as part of it, there is
What's going on all the utopian things and the sort of pessimistic ideas that we've talked about, like nuclear war and, the military-industrial complex. But the development of it and the ability to have the park and ability to produce the works of this in a way disconnected fashion, yeah, it is utopian. I mean, art approaches it or something. I mean, it's not something that can happen very often. Because it did happen with that, what was that Canadian artist that was?
Edwin Harris?
Yeah, I mean, he's one that was able to do that, someone, maybe this is the tradition, Canadian artists here, I'll really get in trouble now. That if you have the ability to do this and the skill, then you produce great things that evolve greatly over time, like Harris or like Jeff. Very dynamic.
Can I just clarify? And I don't know if we want to go back to the paper, but he's not talking about the work or even the opportunity to do it. He's talking about the idea.
His idea for art, is that a utopia?
Art making ultimately affirms our commonality and potential as members within the natural worlds.
Yeah,
That's very important.
it follows the sentence before that is the quotes around the Enlightenment, right?
Is it utopian to think that we can get beyond rationalization? I mean, in a sense, that can we all the rationalizations, the rationalizations of tribalism and religion and the rationalizations of nuclear war or transgenic engineering. Is that utopian? I mean, he even questions: is that something? Is that just me, wishful thinking that that's even possible? And then right after that says, well, but I can't do otherwise because I know about it and I feel strongly about it, and so a person of conscience. And this is a subtext of. You just can't not do what it is you can do. I think there is a sense of this is big, and it may not be able to be affected, but you still have, I still have to try to do something, or at least talk about it.
And as we look back over several years now, evolution has been a constant theme. I really agree with what you're saying. It seems very important to the context in which Jeff works, and that's how I took the GMO, because, these seem like big forces that Jeff would hope an artist would engage in having feelings about and transmitting thoughts about what's important for society, sort of the whole idea of art is knowledge there, I guess. So that's how I took art, curved into that after, when you think of the Cold War was such a huge impact on society, and truly the genetic engineering is it's going to be huge, and you can't undo it. So, but along with that, I feel like I've always tried to struggle with all the conversations has been the whole role of the artist in society, the whole interest in Jeff and having young people involved, really not being just molded by what sells or what is current beliefs, but really thinking about how things evolved, how am I evolving. So that's sort of been one area. But then on another dimension, you have this paper that sort of skips away, because I don't understand philosophy very well, I guess. Skips back to Purdon's paper. For me, that's been fascinating, that Jeff had the ability to work with steel and ability to work with it here and do what he did with it. So I really like that paper, because I think it speaks to his artistry a lot. But I know that we've spent, how many years now? 6 or 5, discussing the philosophical side, which hasn't always been easy for me to be an observer to, but it obviously is extremely important in Jeff's sort of evolution as an artist and how he would like to feel other artists are thinking about the impact of these really quite pessimistic forces on society. So that's what I got out of the GMO. Now, whether he would agree with that, I don't know.
I've always felt that those pessimistic, I don't know if I would call them pessimistic. I think it's simply just, it comes from a place of deep concern, and witnessing existence as it does and being creative in it, there's a certain degree of care that comes from, being a creative person yourself, and then, your creativity and your product is within a context that, then you also care about the continuation of that, and I think that a lot of this tracing back our history through natural history all the way back to the beginning of life is a way of, really valuing humanity and not feeling like we're sort of scum and screwing it all up, and like finding a place, a source to connect to something positive. I really feel like that's a really strong goal, is how do we connect to a place, a narrative where we're not other, we're not the destroyers, we're part of something. And I think that some of these things are sort of saying, listen, there are irrational elements of what we're doing, and I don't get the sense of just throw your hands up and I don't care about it anyway, so who cares? There's definitely a sense of care, and so the attention to these negative things, or these potentially negative things, or potentially disruptive things, are saying, probably cockroaches will go on, and some form of something might go on, but I do value, what life I see here, and I do value certain aspects of it, and so thus it's important to look at it. That I've really appreciated, and I think it's something that, for me, moves it from the aesthetic art world to the this other place where it can, I think, relate to a wider audience in a really serious way. I wouldn't have taken it as seriously without the ideas personally. It would have been a beautiful place. I would have seen it, but listening to him talk about it was like, oh, there's a lot more behind this.
And I think his challenging of what the role of artist is in knowledge creation, but also what I would translate into, he would not say, but I would say activism, it's an interesting challenge for other artists to have to think about those things in their work as more meaningful than just their work.
I don't know that every artist has to do that. I always feel like that's, if you're called to do that and you can do it, then...
You mean articulate?
I think that it's really okay to just make really great art, and I've always felt like this is a bonus. It's a bonus that you can be articulate.
Yeah, I can remember Jack, my I don't know if I want to call him my mentor, my idol. He could articulate art like nobody else. He could really talk about his work. But I've never felt that at all. Occasionally, I manage it. Some people are very good at it.
But Libby, you were talking about activism, so in a way you're talking about Jeff's opinions on certain world issues. Is that what you mean?
I mean, he would never call it that, but I think he feels the need to speak about certain things that he's very concerned about in the world, and although it's implicit in the work, I think he also had to articulate it verbally for people to really understand the breadth of it.
Yeah. And his essays widen it. They put it in a bigger perspective.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, the forum is yes, certainly one of his approaches to activism and the engagement of others and in the ideas and trying to. But I mean, he's got this interest in getting the youth to get engaged in
Yeah.
big, important things that he's trying to stimulate, I think.
Yeah, we had a really interesting discussion on, I think it was the forum that Jay was here, maybe it was 2010, probably 2010, where we had this exchange about efficacy, like how effective is it to, basically be a person of conscience that is completely principled and doesn't, vary, because it's expedient, basically. And what if you live a life doing that and are completely ineffective at, activating that conscience? And, I remember him saying, if you don't have that first thing right, then nothing else, anything else that you're going to do is going to be ineffective anyway. And I remember being really grateful for that comment. I think that's kind of an interesting perspective on activism that just doesn't get articulated because it's so rationalized, like activism is such a rationalized activity.